Hey folks, David Stewart here. It's time for another Thinking Thursday. Today's subject is rent seeking. What is rent seeking? Well, that is trying to get other people to pay you money without you having to do anything for them. This term actually goes all the way back to Adam Smith, the economist, and he classified different behaviors that generate money into three categories. One was labor, like you work on something and you get paid for it directly. You go pick oranges, you get paid for you picking those oranges. The other one is capital investment. You build a factory, you build a machine. That factory machine produces some end good, which is for sale, and you recoup money based on your capital investment. And the third one was rent, which is somebody pays you for the use of something which you own and which they don't own. And that requires you to do essentially nothing. So if you happen to own farmland and a farmer wants to farm, he has to pay you rent in order to farm on it. If you imagine you have an open field and there's nothing on it but grass, and your local sheep farmer, your local sheep herder, your local shepherd wants to graze his sheep on that field, he has to pay you a stipend. He has to pay you rent every month for access to that field. He's paying you rent. And of course, you're doing nothing to maintain that land. Now, what's interesting, starting from this example and kind of going out from there, is that in order for you as the owner of the field to charge rent to the shepherd, you have to have some other authority which is certifying your ownership over the land, meaning there's going to be the state that's involved. There's some magistrate, there's some state official that has signed a document that says you own the plot of land that's surveyed at this particular area. And so if the shepherd comes onto the land which you're not using and grazes his sheep on it, you can go have the constable come and escort him off, or you could sue him. So he has to pay you rent for access to this land which the magistrate says you own. If you imagine you're going to transport this particular situation to, say, the American West during the expansion, where the space is just empty space. Nobody lives out where people were moving into in the mid-19th century. So you move out into an empty area and you say, I now own this land. And someone else comes on and starts building a farm there. And you're like, wait, I own this land. It's like, how do you prove that you own the land? Well, it used to be that you would improve the land somehow. So you go out into no man's land, something that isn't owned by anyone. You build a house on it, therefore you own it. It's turning that land into some sort of investment. You are putting your time, energy, money. You're either paying someone to build a house or you're building a house yourself. You're doing something to the land, which then means that you own what you've produced. You've improved the land and made it useful, and therefore you own the use of the land. Rent seeking may be slightly different from that. Now, in a modern environment, if you're charging rent, say for an apartment, in order to have that apartment to charge rent to somebody to live in it, you had to build the apartment or buy it, meaning you had to do some sort of capital investment. So when somebody's renting an apartment, it's not rent seeking in the negative way that we are trying to discuss here, but it's just kind of a recoupment on your capital investment. Not only that, but at least here in the United States, and especially where I live in California, the landlord has a certain responsibility to the tenants and to his capital investment to maintain it. So the tenants, if the sink breaks, for instance, they call the landlord, and the landlord has a responsibility to fix that sink, because part of the rent is that you're renting what you've improved. You're not just renting an empty plot of land, you're renting the apartment which you've improved, which means you have to maintain that level for the people that are renting it. And so even though there's a lot of conflict between, say, renters and landlords that ends up in court, in general, landlords are required to maintain the basic habitability of the apartments that they're renting or the houses that they're renting. And the tenants, of course, are responsible for damages that they make to those improvements. It's a pretty basic relationship. And the positive thing about rent is that people who are unable to acquire enough capital to buy a thing like a house can still rent something because rent is usually a little bit cheaper than the actual investment of buying. So having one person own something and rent it to another is often good, because the person who's renting it, by definition, doesn't really have enough money to buy one of those things. Now, where rent seeking actually takes a very dark turn, and where we see it, I guess, manifested in the modern world, is through the acquirement of assets which require people to pay and which do literally nothing for the person required to pay. A really good example is patents and patent trolls. So if you happen to own a patent on something, so if a company buys a patent or you make something, in order to do whatever is on that patent, you have to pay the person who owns the patent money. Essentially, you have to pay them rent. Now, this could take a very dark turn when there's companies that say they own some element of a UI on a website, for example. There's some UI element that they've patented. So now they view that patent as actually an asset that they can use to charge rent. If you want to do this UI element, you have to pay us rent. You have to pay us money for the right to do it. And if you don't, we'll sue you. And so we'll charge the rent by suing you through the court. And the court is going to enforce that. And it goes back to the idea that you can't really charge rent in this kind of, I don't know what to call it, in a negative way. You can't really charge rent in a way that's going to exploit the person who's renting, unless you have the intervention of the state on your behalf. Because if you own an empty plot of land and you've done no improvements to it, in a world without that state, the sheep herder would simply say, well, this is empty space. You can't own empty space. You can't own land that you haven't done anything to. That's a basic part of land ownership. So he would freely graze his sheep on the land. It's only when the state gets involved that you're allowed to sue the person for wanting to graze your sheep on empty land that you've done nothing to. Likewise with patents, what are you doing? You're not giving somebody anything. Somebody who designs a website and includes a UI element that they program themselves has done all of the work themselves. They've programmed it, they've done it all, but because you say that you own the patent on that particular UI element, you can take them to court or sue them, or just merely by the idea that you could sue them. You send them a letter that says cease and desist or pay us rent, and so people will pay up. It's kind of like extortion. So extortion is a kind of rent seeking. And so most relationships in the modern world that involve just extracting money from people without giving them anything in return is a kind of rent seeking. There are many, 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 many more examples. Let's say you want to build a house. You've bought a plot of land. You're going to build a house. Well, you may have to have an environmental impact survey done. That's something that you have to have done in my state of California, and I believe you have to have done in numerous other states here in the U.S., and you might have to have it done in Europe. I'm not sure because I don't know all the laws all over the world. But basically, you have to pay for somebody who has some kind of environmental impact certification to come out, look at the spot where you're going to build and improve the land, and come up with a report, write a report that's going to specify what kind of impact it's going to have on the local environment. Now, is this report going to actually stop people from building buildings? In most cases, it's no. But you still have to pay for it regardless. That's a form of rent seeking. You get literally nothing good in return, but you still have to pay someone to do something. Smog checks on your vehicles are a form of rent seeking, particularly when they're done by private enterprises, which in the state of California they are, as they were in the state of Nevada when I lived there. So you have to take your car to a smog check. They put it on a machine, they hook it up to a computer, and then they run your car and determine whether it's producing bad or good smog, and you have to pay them for that privilege. That's rent seeking. Of course, an industry that exists on checking people's emissions is not going to want to overturn a law that does nothing for the people who are actually driving cars, and probably does nothing for the environment as well. Let's be honest about that. But it is a form of rent seeking because the person having to pay for it actually gets nothing for it. It's not like the government is paying to have these people check for the emissions through some government program. They're making the people who own cars just directly pay every time the state says you have to do it. That's definitely a form of rent seeking, particularly when you drive around and you see registered cars like billowing black smoke out of the top like coal burning. You're like, clearly this program doesn't do what it's intended to do. There's numerous other ones. And notice that they all have something in common, which is that they're enforced through the authority of the state. You may have to pay a license fee to have a television in your home. That can be a form of rent seeking. That's something that exists in the United Kingdom. You have to pay the television licensing fee to pay for the BBC, which you don't watch and don't like. You also, around here, you have to pay for telephone access, and it's like a $5 fee. Even if you don't use the telephone, you may have to pay that. Now, because we don't actually have a landline, we've gone away from that, but you may have to deal with that where you're at in particular. So all of these things are kinds of rent-seeking behavior. That is, somebody has minimal investment or no investment, but they have a government-certified ownership over something, which allows them to sue other people or use the power of the state to collect rent on their behalf. This is something large corporations continue to do, which is why there's so much lobbying. Copyright laws are another form of rent-seeking. The fact that you can sue somebody over a Mickey Mouse cartoon. Every single person who has worked on the Mickey Mouse cartoon from 1940 or whenever it was is dead. Every person who contributed to it is dead. Their children might be dead as well, but the corporation, which was descended from the person who made that particular show, can sue people into oblivion for showing something that no living person has any creative claim to ownership over. They've done nothing to improve it. It's just that the state says that they own it. So copyright laws can be a form of rent-seeking. In general, intellectual property laws enable a large degree of rent-seeking. Banks involve themselves in rent-seeking in a number of different ways, but that might be a little bit too complex or just make this video far longer than I actually want it to be. There you go. That's rent-seeking. So whenever you see somebody lobbying Congress, chances are they're trying to figure out how to collect some rent on you. That's one of the things that they like to do. They force you to buy more expensive light bulbs. That's rent seeking. All of that stuff is there to allow them to get something for nothing. So thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you guys next time, and links are down in the description in case you want to buy my books or anything like that. Have a great one. Later.